My sister locked me in my room while my blood sugar dropped to 30, and my dad stayed downstairs believing her lies that I was trying to ruin the dinner party. Imagine this. I'm locked in my own bedroom, my body shaking, my blood sugar plummeting, and the woman who was supposed to be a part of my family, she's downstairs, laughing, hosting a dinner party. She literally left me there to die. My blood sugar monitor was screaming 52 and dropping fast. I knew, with a horrifying clarity, that I had maybe 18 minutes before I'd completely lose consciousness. I was only 17, a high schooler with type 1 diabetes, and my dad's girlfriend of 7 months had just sealed me in my room. All because she wanted the perfect setting for her networking dinner. I'd been managing my type 1 diabetes for 7 years, ever since I was 10. My routine was second nature, testing blood sugar, counting carbs, delivering insulin through my pump. My mom died when I was 7, and for 3 years, it was just my dad and me, navigating life, and then suddenly, my diabetes diagnosis, which turned our world into a delicate balance of numbers and time. Dad, a commercial real estate developer, worked brutal hours, but he always made time for my endocrinologist appointments, always made sure I had all my supplies. When he started dating again, about 4 years after Mom passed, I tried to be supportive. I wanted him to be happy, even if the thought of someone replacing Mom made my chest ache. Olivia Bennett was the 5th woman he dated seriously. Unlike the others, who were polite but clearly intimidated by a kid with a chronic illness, Olivia seemed almost too perfect. She was 36, Dad was 47, a pharmaceutical sales rep with a sharp style and the kind of confidence that made people listen. Before meeting me, she'd researched type 1 diabetes, asked thoughtful questions about my management, even recommended a new insulin pump model that her company didn't sell but had better features. Dad fell hard and fast. I tried to be happy for him, brushing aside the tiny red flags that Olivia's perfection felt like a performance with an agenda I couldn't quite put my finger on. About 4 months into their relationship, Olivia started commenting on my blood sugar levels. That was the first hint of trouble. She'd asked to check my readings every evening, cloaking it in concern, but her tone was always judgmental when my numbers weren't perfect. She'd question if I'd counted my carbs correctly or if I was sneaking things I shouldn't have. Never mind that type 1 diabetes doesn't work that way, or that my doctor said my control was excellent. When I explained that blood sugar fluctuates for all sorts of reasons beyond food, Olivia would just smile, say she worked in pharmaceuticals, and knew more about medical conditions than most. Dad would nod along, seemingly impressed by her expertise, and I'd let it go, even though her understanding was superficial and wrong in critical areas. The second red flag popped up when she moved into our house after only 6 months of dating. With her came fancy furniture and a desire to rearrange our entire domestic routine. Suddenly, family dinners had to start at 6:30 p.m., regardless of my insulin schedule. My diabetic supplies had to be housed in designated spaces that matched her aesthetic, rather than where they were most convenient for me. She'd rearranged the kitchen and moved my emergency glucose stash from the counter to a high cupboard because the packaging looked cluttered. And every time I put it back on the counter, she'd move it again. Dad had weekly intervened, suggesting I keep supplies in my room if Olivia wanted a clean kitchen, not grasping that diabetic emergencies don't wait for you to run upstairs. I just complied to keep the peace, putting a small fridge in my room for insulin and scattering glucose pills around, knowing that fighting back would lead to a confrontation Dad couldn't handle. The third, blaring red sign appeared last month when Olivia started planning tonight's dinner party. This was a high-stakes evening with Dad's most important potential clients, the Maxwells, whose company could land him his biggest contract yet. Olivia completely took over the planning, hiring caterers and event staff, transforming our home into something out of a magazine. She was obsessed with every detail, yelling at both Dad and me when things weren't perfect, stressing about lighting, music, flower arrangements. When I asked about the menu, if I could see carb counts to plan my insulin, Olivia waved me off. "Oh, I'll handle it. You shouldn't worry about food. Just enjoy the evening." That dismissal made my stomach clench. Managing diabetes means always knowing what and when I'm eating, but she made it seem like I was being difficult for even asking. Yesterday, she informed me I'd be eating dinner in my room tonight, not joining the party, because teenagers make events feel too informal. Dad had weekly protested, saying I was family, and should be included. But Olivia insisted this was business, not family time, and my presence would detract from professional networking. She promised to bring me a plate and said I could come down for dessert, making it sound reasonable, even though we both knew she was just excluding me to maintain her flawless image. I agreed, because arguing with Olivia always made Dad anxious, and I'd learned it was easier to preserve the peace than to assert my own needs. This afternoon, everything shattered. Olivia was in the kitchen, overseeing the caterers, when I came down around 4 p.m. to check my blood sugar and grab a snack before dinner. My continuous glucose monitor, my CGM, had been drifting downward all afternoon, hovering in the low 80s, and I needed something to bring it back up before it hit dangerous territory. I just grabbed a juice box from the fridge, the quick sugar I relied on in these situations, when Olivia appeared beside me, absolutely furious. She snatched the juice box from my hand, declaring I wasn't allowed to eat or drink anything before the dinner party. The caterers needed the kitchen clear, and she didn't want me interrupting their work. I tried to explain my blood sugar was plummeting, that I needed the juice now, not later, but she cut me off. She called me overdramatic. She accused me of sabotaging her evening, of creating medical crises for attention, of being jealous that Dad had found someone new, of manipulating situations with my diabetes. The accusations were so shocking, so out of left field, that I just stood there, transfixed, as she threw the juice box in the trash and ordered me to my room. "Stay there," she hissed, "until your father comes to get you for dinner." When I started to object, she leaned in close and told me in hushed tones that if I caused any trouble tonight, if I made a scene or tried to divert Dad's focus from his clients, she'd make sure he knew how manipulative I had been about my medical condition. She reminded me that Dad's business was struggling, that this deal could save our family's finances, and that my selfishness had the potential to destroy everything he had worked so hard for. I went upstairs, shivering with a mix of rage and terror. My blood sugar was at 70 and dropping. I texted Dad for help, but his phone was on silent for the client dinner prep. I checked my supplies, remembering my backup emergency glucose was in the kitchen where Olivia had just barred me. My insulin pump indicated I had plenty in the reservoir, but I need to change it tomorrow. The logical thing would have been to go downstairs and grab some juice while Olivia was busy. But her threats, and my father's reliance on tonight's success, had paralyzed me. Instead, I tried to manage with the glucose pills I had in my room, taking 4 and waiting to see if my blood sugar stabilized. For 30 minutes, I watched my CGM. It hovered in the mid-70s before dropping again. At 60, I knew I needed more glucose, so I reached for the container to take more pills. And that's when I heard Olivia coming up the stairs. I'd gone to the door, hoping to beg her for juice, convinced that she wouldn't let me slip into diabetic shock. But as I opened the door, she was already there, hand poised to knock. Her expression was cold and determined as she pulled me back into the room and told me I needed to stay until the clients left, because she couldn't trust me not to spoil her evening. She noticed my glucose tablet bottle, and when it fell, she deliberately kicked it away before walking out and locking the door from the outside with the old skeleton key, the old-fashioned mechanism Dad had thought was charming when we bought the house. Now, I was on my hands and knees, fumbling over the carpet for scattered glucose pills, my vision starting to tunnel. My CGM was screaming alarms, displaying 45 and dropping, a rapid plummet that would leave me unconscious soon. I found 3 pills and devoured them furiously. The chalky taste, once comforting, now served as a stark reminder of how inadequate they were for this disaster. When I finally managed to unlock my phone, my hands were shaking so violently I could barely hold it. My fingers wouldn't cooperate with the touchscreen to dial 911. I dialed Dad's number, but it went straight to voicemail. His phone remained silent during the dinner gathering. I tried texting my best friend, Sophia, but the message came out as gibberish. Autocorrect couldn't make sense of my failing motor control. Below me, I could hear the dinner party begin. People greeting each other with professional warmth. Olivia Bennett's giggle, bright and sweet, as she welcomed the Maxwells to our home. The sounds were surreal, a perfectly normal social gathering taking place while I was isolated in my room, dying of hypoglycemia. I considered yelling for help, but Olivia had put on classical piano music downstairs, which would easily drown out any sounds from upstairs. She'd meticulously planned this, ensuring that even if I tried to draw attention, the dinner party would continue uninterrupted. I made it to my bed before my legs gave out completely, collapsing onto the mattress as my blood sugar continued its terrifying descent. At 37, I knew I was in grave danger. That's the level where convulsions and unconsciousness occur, and irreversible brain injury is a real possibility. My thoughts grew disorganized and sluggish. Severe hypoglycemia causes cognitive impairment, which makes problem-solving incredibly difficult. I tried the door again, crawling because standing was no longer an option, and tugged on the handle with weak hands. The lock held firm, and Olivia had presumably taken the key with her, as I couldn't see it through the old-fashioned keyhole. My window was on the second floor, overlooking the backyard, too high to safely jump, and facing away from the street where anyone might notice me. I considered smashing the window and screaming, but the dinner party was in the formal dining room on the other side of the house. The catering staff were in the kitchen, and the music would drown out any sounds. Plus, shattering a window during Dad's most important business dinner would surely jeopardize the contract he desperately needed, proving Olivia's claim that I was trying to sabotage the event. The thought pulled me between survival instinct and the psychological trickery she'd spent months perfecting, making me wonder if dying peacefully was preferable to spoiling her perfect night. My phone vibrated with a text from Sophia, asking if I wanted to video chat, and I tried to respond, but my fingers stopped working. The CGM was reading 34, critically low, and I could feel awareness slipping away in waves. I thought about my mom, how she would never have allowed this to happen, how she would have prioritized my health above any business dinner or social obligation. I thought about Dad downstairs, utterly oblivious that his daughter was dying 20 feet above him because he had trusted his girlfriend over his own instincts. For a brief moment, the rage that surged through me cleared the fog, and I used that clarity to try again to dial 911. My hand was shaking so violently I couldn't see the screen, but I managed to press the emergency call button before my vision tunneled to a pinpoint and then went dark. I don't know if the call connected. I don't know if I said anything coherent. I only knew that I felt myself slipping into darkness as dinner party chatter and laughter boomed beneath my bedroom floor. The next 30 minutes were a flurry of medical evaluations and probing questions. Emma stayed with me while her partner, an older man named Rick Turner, a paramedic for 18 years, assessed my vital signs and tested my blood sugar again. They explained that 911 received a call from my phone around 7:20 p.m., heard heavy breathing followed by silence, and when the operator didn't get a response, dispatched emergency personnel to my location. The fire department arrived first, finding the front door locked with the dinner party ongoing. They yelled loudly until someone responded, then forced their way upstairs when they heard my CGM alarm blaring from my bedroom door. They found the door locked from the outside with the old skeleton key still in the lock, and me unconscious on the floor, my blood sugar at 30 and dangerously low for an extended period. Rick explained that they had administered glucagon promptly and called for police assistance because the locked door indicated concerns about suspected negligence or abuse. Now, there were 2 LAPD detectives in my room. Detective Mia Sullivan, a 12-year veteran, and a uniformed officer named Daniel Grant, who was photographing the door, the lock, and the scattered glucose pills on my carpet. Detective Sullivan crouched by my bed, where the paramedics had moved me, and asked if I felt well enough to answer questions. When I nodded, she took out a recording device and asked me to recount everything that had transpired today from the beginning. I told her everything, my voice growing stronger as my blood sugar stabilized, the words pouring out in a surge of rage, terror, and relief. I detailed Olivia moving my glucose supplies, the juice box incident this afternoon, her threats that I was spoiling the dinner party, and her locking me in just as my blood sugar was dropping. Detective Sullivan listened without interrupting, her face impassive, but her eyes sharp. When I finished, she asked specific questions regarding the time and words Olivia had used. She inquired if there were any witnesses to Olivia's threats or any evidence such as messages or recordings. I pulled up my earlier text exchange with Dad, which showed my unanswered calls for help, gave her my CGM app data indicating the blood sugar drop and critical alarms, and suggested that the caterers might have witnessed the juice box incident this afternoon. Detective Sullivan nodded, stating she would be interviewing everyone in the home, and that this was now a criminal investigation into child endangerment and attempted murder. The phrase attempted murder made my chest constrict, realizing the truth of how close I had come to death. Emma noticed my distress and suggested they let me rest before asking further questions. But I shook my head and replied, I want to finish. I wanted to make sure they realized Olivia had done this on purpose, and that it was not a mistake or misunderstanding. Dad entered the room after Detective Sullivan concluded her initial questioning, his face dark and his eyes red as if he had been crying. He knelt by the bed and took my hand, saying he was so sorry. He had no idea what was going on, that Olivia had assured him I was fine and just needed some space. His voice trembled as he questioned why I hadn't come down if I was experiencing a medical emergency, and I had to explain that I'd been locked in, that I tried to call and text, and that I'd done everything I could to get help. The revelation that his partner had intentionally harmed his child while he was 20 feet away, entertaining guests, seemed to break something in him. He wailed on the bed next to me, and I found myself comforting him, despite the fact that I had almost died. Emma and Rick exchanged glances but didn't intervene, allowing the scene to play out as they prepared to transfer me to the hospital for observation. Detective Sullivan stepped into the hallway to speak with Officer Grant, and I could hear her giving directions about securing the area and separating witnesses for questioning. The dinner party had apparently been disrupted when the paramedics forced their way in, and the Maxwells and catering staff had left. Everyone made statements to the police about what they had seen and heard. Olivia was in the hallway, being questioned by another officer, when they wheeled me out on the stretcher. She still looked beautiful, her dinner dress unwrinkled and her makeup impeccable, but her face was a mask of cold fury under a thin veneer of worry. She tried to approach me, claiming she had been anxious and was relieved that I was fine. But Detective Sullivan physically stopped her, telling her to stay back. Olivia's mask dropped for a second. Her eyes flashed with something ugly before the worried girlfriend performance resumed. She explained to my father that she was simply trying to give me room to calm down, that she had no idea my blood sugar was plummeting, and that this was a horrible mistake. Dad was walking beside the stretcher. Then he turned to face her. He really looked at her, and I saw a fundamental change in his expression. He confronted her about taking the key when she left my room, removing my glucose supplies from the kitchen, and throwing away my juice box despite my pleas. Olivia's countenance shifted between several emotions before settling on defensive rage. She said that she had been trying to teach me responsibility and independence, that I had been manipulating him with my diabetes, and that she was helping him set boundaries. The words hung in the hallway like poison, revealing all she'd been doing for months. And Dad's face shifted from anguish to fury so quickly that I barely registered the change. He instructed her to leave his home, and that she had only 1 hour to gather her belongings before he called the police. The ambulance ride to UCLA Medical Center lasted 20 minutes. Emma stayed with me in the back, while Dad followed in his car. She kept monitoring my blood sugar and spoke to me, making sure I was alert and responsive, asking about my usual management routine and how long I had been type 1. When I told her my history, she remarked I'd been doing very well given the circumstances, as many kids my age struggled with compliance, but the A1C figures I provided demonstrated good control. Olivia had implied for months that I was careless and theatrical about my health, so the affirmation felt vital. Emma carefully inquired about past instances in which Olivia had interfered with my diabetic treatment, and I realized there were countless little situations that I had downplayed or explained away. She used to insist that I couldn't test my blood sugar at the dinner table because it was unhygienic, causing me to go to the restroom and miss the precise timing I needed for insulin dosage. She had questioned if I actually required snacks between meals or if I was simply trying to consume junk food. She even mentioned to Dad that I might be faking my problems to garner attention, that teens were notorious for drama, and that I'd probably be all right if everyone disregarded my concerns. Each recollection seemed different today, not as misunderstandings, but as deliberate attempts to damage my health management and my connection with my father. Emma listened without judgment and stated that she was writing everything for the police report and that this pattern would be valuable evidence. I was admitted to the hospital's pediatric ward for observation, which is standard procedure for severe hypoglycemia episodes. My blood sugar level had stabilized at 98, which was comfortably normal. However, Dr. Charles Morgan, The attending endocrinologist who had been brought in wanted to watch me overnight to verify that there were no lingering issues. Dr. Morgan was in his 50s, with gray hair and wire-rimmed spectacles. According to the qualifications on the wall, he had been practicing pediatric endocrinology for the past 26 years. He went over my medical history with Dad and me, asking specific questions about my management regimen and what had led to tonight's crisis. When I described that Olivia had restricted my access to glucose and locked me in my room, his countenance turned deliberately blank, as it does when doctors hear information that triggers mandatory reporting requirements. He excused himself and returned 10 minutes later with a woman he introduced as Natalie Miller, a social worker with Child Protective Services who specialized in medical neglect cases. Natalie was perhaps 40, with kind brown eyes and a no-nonsense approach that made me feel instantly safer. She pulled up a chair next to my bed and said she needed to hear my story, that what occurred tonight was major medical negligence and probably willful endangerment. I repeated the tale again, this time with Dad sitting next to me, hearing all the information I hadn't told him about Olivia's actions in the previous months. I studied his expression as I narrated each episode, seeing him make connections he'd missed while it was occurring, and seeing how deliberately she'd isolated me and undermined my health management. Natalie made thorough notes and asked clarifying questions, including whether Olivia had ever denied me access to medical treatment or diabetic supplies. Natalie nodded as if she had heard similar patterns previously when I recalled her relocating my emergency glucose to difficult-to-reach spots and her statements that I was exaggerating my symptoms. She stated that people who care for children with medical issues have a legal duty to offer access to required therapies, and intentionally withholding such access might be considered abuse under California law. She stated that CPS would launch an investigation, that Detective Sullivan was already working with her office, and that they would determine if Dad's home was safe for me considering what had occurred. Dad's face turned white as he wondered whether they were going to take me away. Natalie's expression softened, and she explained that that wasn't the purpose. The inquiry was about identifying what protections needed to be in place, but Olivia could no longer have access to me or be present in the house where I resided. Detective Sullivan came about 10 p.m. with updates on the inquiry. She'd interviewed the catering crew, and 2 of them had observed the juice box incident, which confirmed my claim that Olivia had withdrawn critical medical supplies from me despite my explanation that I needed them. She'd also interviewed the Maxwells, who had an intriguing take on the dinner gathering. Apparently, as the paramedics barged in, Olivia tried to stop them from going upstairs, claiming that I was okay and being theatrical. One of the paramedics heard my CGM warning from the 2nd floor and proceeded past her nevertheless, and the Maxwells had witnessed Olivia's facade fall entirely. Her worry transformed into rage at having her evening disturbed. Mrs. Maxwell had expressly informed Detective Sullivan that Olivia's behavior had struck her as inappropriate, that she appeared more worried about the dinner party than a medical issue, and that she had attempted to persuade the paramedics to leave before checking on me. The testimony was devastating. Outside witnesses having no motivation to mislead described Olivia's priorities. Detective Sullivan stated she also received the 911 tape from my phone call, in which, while being fairly incoherent, I managed to say locked in and dying before losing consciousness, indicating that I was aware of the planned imprisonment. The combination of physical evidence, witness testimony, and my statement was sufficient to warrant criminal charges, and the DA's office was looking into potential charges of child endangerment, false imprisonment, and assault. Dad stayed with me in the hospital room that night, sitting on the uncomfortable chair beside my bed, despite my instructions to go home and sleep. He appeared to have aged years in a matter of hours as the truth of what had almost transpired reached him in waves. When I awoke at midnight, I found him looking at his phone, tears streaming down his cheeks. He'd been going over text exchanges between him and Olivia over the previous 7 months, seeing things differently now and spotting manipulation he'd missed in the moment. He showed me some of these communications in which she discreetly undercut me, told him I was being tough with my diabetes care, said that I was envious of their relationship and used medical circumstances to obtain attention. Dad said he trusted her because she appeared so intelligent and confident, and he wanted to think that someone loved him enough to handle the complexities of our lives. He disregarded his feelings that something was wrong because he'd been lonely, and Olivia appeared like the cure to that loneliness. He apologized again, more precisely this time, admitting that he had failed to protect me, that he had chosen his girlfriend's version of events above his daughter's truth, and that he had allowed someone dangerous into our house. I explained it wasn't his fault Olivia had been manipulative, but he shook his head and claimed it was his responsibility for not paying attention, for being so preoccupied with his career and his relationship, that he missed indicators that should have been evident. Dr. Charles Morgan discharged me the next afternoon with orders to see my usual endocrinologist and to have unfettered access to diabetic supplies at all times. He documented the incident in full and stated that the medical records would be made accessible to police enforcement and CPS for their investigations. He also provided Dad with a list of warning indicators of medical neglect and abuse, underlining the importance of watchful monitoring of chronic diseases and the dire consequences of any interference with such management. Dad informed me on the car ride home that Olivia had left the house with 2 bags the day before, that he had the locks changed that morning, and that he had filed a restraining order with Detective Sullivan's aid. Olivia was not allowed to come within 90 yards of me or our house, was not permitted to contact any of us, and would risk instant arrest if she broke those rules. He'd also called Rachel Anderson, a family law attorney who specialized in custody and protection issues, who told him to document everything and thoroughly cooperate with CPS to show that he was serious about the problem and guaranteeing my safety. The restraining order hearing was planned for next week, and Rachel predicted Olivia would fight it, saying it was all a misunderstanding and that I had been having a medical episode that she didn't comprehend. When we returned home, the house seemed empty, but also safer because Olivia's presence had been removed. Dad had taken all of her stuff, including her expensive furniture and the portraits she had posted on the walls, creating areas that appeared bare but felt cleaner. He'd also returned my diabetic supplies to their rightful placements, placing emergency glucose on the kitchen counter and in different rooms to ensure I was never more than a few steps away from assistance if I needed it. He had printed out my CGM sharing rights and loaded the program on his phone, allowing him to remotely monitor my blood sugar levels. Olivia had convinced him that this was invasive helicopter parenting, but it was actually standard procedure for type 1 management. He was overcompensating, I could tell, by hovering and asking if I needed anything every few minutes. But I allowed him because we both needed the confidence that comes with attentiveness. Sophia arrived that evening with flowers and chocolate-covered pretzels, my favorite comfort food that I could have if I used insulin appropriately. She'd been monitoring my infrequent text updates and had become concerned when I went silent during the hypoglycemia episode. She stated she nearly called the police herself, but assumed I was simply asleep. She now felt bad for not acting on her intuition, and I had to tell her the same thing I had told Dad. Olivia's manipulation was so successful that no one realized what was going on until it was nearly too late. The criminal case progressed faster than I expected. Within 4 days, Olivia Bennett was charged with child endangerment, false imprisonment, and assault. The assault accusation was premised on her aggressively shoving me into my room and physically removing medical supplies that I required, both of which constituted detrimental contact under California law. Detective Sullivan phoned to explain that the district attorney treated these matters seriously, especially when there was clear evidence and witness testimony, and that Olivia had been detained that morning at her temporary residence. Bail was set at $50,000, which her family quickly paid. However, the conditions of her release included a restraining order and GPS tracking to ensure she kept away from us. Detective Sullivan stated that the evidence was solid with the 911 audio, witness accounts, medical documents, and my testimony, leaving little opportunity for Olivia to claim ignorance or accident. The DA advocated for a trial rather than a plea bargain. In wishing to make an example of someone who intentionally harmed a child with a medical problem, the trial was planned for 4 months out, which is usual for criminal trials. And Detective Sullivan informed me that I would have to testify. The concept horrified me, but it also felt important, like if I needed to get up in court and publicly explain what Olivia had done. CPS concluded their inquiry 2 weeks later with a finding of proven medical neglect on Olivia, but no charges against Dad. Natalie Miller visited with us to explain that the inquiry had revealed that Dad had been an unsuspecting victim of Olivia's deception, that he had no awareness of her meddling with my diabetes treatment, and that he had taken swift corrective action once he realized the circumstances. She stated that the home was now deemed safe for me, but she recommended family counseling to help us understand what had happened and restore trust. She also advised that I visit with a therapist separately to go through the trauma of the situation, particularly the horror of being shut in during a medical crisis. Dad agreed to everything and had previously booked meetings with Dr. Robert Hayes, a family therapist who specializes in trauma healing. Dr. Hayes was in his 60s and had a soothing personality. And in our first session, he helped us begin to untangle the guilt, rage, and fear that had gotten intertwined. He worked with Dad to understand how he had been deceived and to regain his trust in his parenting abilities. He helped me comprehend the betrayal of someone who should have protected me instead of attempting to murder me, as well as separate that experience from my future capacity to trust people. The restraining order hearing took place 4 weeks after the event, and it was my first time seeing Olivia since that night. She appeared different in court, less polished and more desperate, her costly clothing rumpled, and her makeup insufficient to conceal the tension. Her counsel claimed that the restraining order was disproportionate, that Olivia had made a mistake of judgment, but did not want to cause damage, and that she was eager to repent and make apologies. Rachel Anderson, Dad's attorney, delivered the evidence systematically. The medical records showed how near I had come to death. The witness accounts outlining Olivia's behavior, as well as the timeline demonstrating her premeditated acts. Despite the fact that I was in crisis, she played segments of the 911 tape in which my garbled voice begged for assistance, and I studied Olivia's face as she heard it. There was no regret, only calculation about how this would damage her case. The judge, Judge O'Connor, listened to everything before issuing her verdict. She determined that Olivia represented a genuine threat to my safety, that her conduct were intentional and knowing, and that the restraining order would be in effect for 5 years, with the possibility of an extension depending on the outcome of the criminal trial. Judge O'Connor also expressed worry about Olivia's apparent lack of contrition in court, stating that she appeared to be more concerned with minimizing her acts than with addressing the hurt she had caused. Olivia's face hardened as the mask finally dropped entirely, and for a brief moment, I saw the person who had locked me in my room and walked away. The trial began in late October, for months after the tragedy, and received substantial media coverage. Local press had picked up on the issue, casting it as a cautionary tale about adults who refused to take children's medical illnesses seriously, and the courtroom was filled with journalists and diabetic children's rights campaigners. The prosecution, led by Deputy DA Jennifer Hayes, presented a meticulous case that began with Olivia's connection with Dad and ended the night she locked me in my room. Jennifer summoned witnesses in a deliberate sequence. First, the catering workers witnessed the juice box event. Then came the paramedics who discovered me unconscious. Then, Dr. Charles Morgan addressed the medical implications of hypoglycemia. Then, Detective Sullivan went over the evidence and investigation. Each witness provided more damaging testimony, establishing a picture of willful harm that could not be explained away as an accident or ignorance. When it was my turn to testify, Jennifer carefully guided me through the events, asking precise questions that allowed me to relate the narrative in my own words while ensuring that the legal aspects were addressed. I talked about my diabetes control, Olivia's months of meddling, the precise threat she made that afternoon, and hearing the key turn in the lock while my blood sugar was dropping. I detailed the dread of being confined, knowing I was dying but powerless to seek help, and hearing the dinner party continue while I passed out on my bedroom floor. Olivia's defense attorney, Mark Donovan, attempted to raise reasonable doubt by claiming that I had locked myself in by accident, that Olivia was unaware of the severity of my condition, and that she had been acting on advice from pharmaceutical colleagues who had told her teenagers that exaggerated symptoms were common. His cross-examination was forceful, hinting that I was a difficult adolescent who despised Olivia's presence and set up scenarios to turn Dad against her. He asked if I'd ever lied about my blood sugar levels, missed insulin shots on purpose, or manipulated my diabetes to gain attention or avoid obligations. Rachel had prepped me for this technique, stating that defense counsel would attempt to undermine my credibility and I responded to each inquiry calmly and honestly, admitting that I had made mistakes in management, but emphasizing that none of it warranted being trapped in a room during a medical emergency. The jury was paying close attention to these conversations, and I could see several of them staring at Olivia in disdain, especially when Mark Donovan implied that I had planned the entire affair to frame an innocent lady. The notion was so ludicrous and harsh that even Mark seemed to recognize he'd lost the jury with that strategy. The prosecution's closing arguments were devastating. Jennifer Hayes guided the jury through every piece of evidence, witness comment, and documented instance of Olivia's intentional interference with my medical treatment. She pointed out that Olivia had worked in pharmaceuticals, that she was aware of hypoglycemia and its potential repercussions, and that her claims of ignorance were utterly contradicted by her professional experience. She played the 911 tape again, my voice barely audible as I screamed for assistance while confined in my room. She then urged the jurors to envision their own children confined and dying while an adult who could assist walked away. She reminded them that I was 17 years old, had a controllable medical condition, and should have been secure in my own house. But instead I almost died, because someone thought that a business dinner was more important than a child's life. The jury debated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges, including child endangerment, false imprisonment, and assault. Olivia's face was expressionless as the judgments were announced, but her fists were clutching the defense table tightly enough that her knuckles were white. Judge O'Connor set the sentencing date for 4 weeks out, and Olivia was remanded to jail awaiting that hearing. The judge noted that she had showed no remorse and presented a flight risk due to the probable jail sentence. The weather on sentencing day was chilly and wet, which was suitable for the occasion. The courtroom was packed again, this time with victim advocates and medical professionals who had written testimonies emphasizing the need of treating children's medical concerns seriously. During the sentencing phase, Judge O'Connor heard testimony from a number of witnesses, including Dr. Harris, my regular endocrinologist, who testified that my diabetes control had been good prior to Olivia's intervention and that her actions had put me at risk of irreversible consequences. She heard from Dr. Morgan, who gave expert testimony that my blood sugar level of 30 was an instant life-threatening crisis, and that another 10 minutes without assistance may have resulted in severe brain damage or death. She heard from Natalie Miller, who stated that medical neglect instances were especially dangerous since fragile youngsters relied on adults for survival. And she heard from me, a victim impact statement that I had written and updated dozens of times in an attempt to reflect the long-term impact of being deceived by someone who was supposed to protect me. I mentioned that I still had dreams about being confined in that room, and that I was concerned about my blood sugar lowering since I had connected hypoglycemia with being trapped and helpless. I said that Olivia had taken something from me that I would never get back. The expectation that the grown-ups in my life would prioritize my safety over their own convenience. Judge O'Connor sentenced Olivia to 9 years in state prison, the maximum allowable by California sentencing guidelines for the combined crimes. She noted that the sentence reflected Olivia's premeditated acts, misuse of a position of trust, lack of contrition, and the significant harm she had caused. She pointed out that Olivia had put her social image ahead of a child's life, that she had been methodically undermining medical treatment for months, and that her actions on the night of the dinner party were premeditated and intentional. She stated that persons responsible for children had basic responsibility to safeguard them, and that breaking those commitments in such a heinous manner deserved harsh repercussions. Olivia would be eligible for parole after serving 85% of her sentence, or around 7 years. However, Judge O'Connor advised that the parole board examine her lack of contrition when determining her release. I awoke to shouting and bright lights shining through my closed eyes. Someone said my name, asking me to open them. When I finally cracked them open, I saw a paramedic's face hovering above me. She was young, maybe in her late 20s, with gentle eyes and hair pulled back in a bun, and she was telling me that I was okay, that they had given me glucagon, and that my blood sugar was rising again. My arm stung where N4 was inserted, and I could taste the sickly sweet residue of the glucagon shot that had saved my life. The paramedic, Emma Lawson, introduced herself as being with the LA County Fire Department and asked if I could tell her what had happened. My lips were dry, and my thoughts were muddled, but I managed to mutter that I had been locked in my room. Emma's expression instantly shifted from professional concern to focused intensity, and she asked me to repeat it. Behind her, I could see another paramedic talking to someone in the doorway, and despite my still foggy vision, I recognized my father's silhouette, his posture radiating worry and perplexity. Emma leaned in and asked directly who had locked me in the room and when. I told her it was Olivia, about 2 hours ago, just before the dinner party. The other paramedic looked at Emma, then called for the police officers who had presumably arrived with the ambulance. Olivia looked at me with venom as she was brought out of the courthouse in handcuffs. There was no pretense remaining. She had lost everything. She blamed me for her freedom, reputation, and future rather than taking responsibility for her own acts. I caught her gaze and felt nothing. There was no fear or fury, only the cool knowledge that justice had been delivered and that she would never touch me again. When Dad and I left the courthouse, there was a mob of media waiting for remarks, but Rachel Anderson handled them while we slipped out a side entrance. Throughout the trial, the media focused on my case, making it a focal point for conversations about medical negligence and the special vulnerability of children with chronic illnesses. Diabetes advocacy groups used the case to advocate for improved type 1 diabetes education and greater protections for children in need of medical care. I'd received hundreds of mails from other type 1 diabetics who had seen similar dismissals of their symptoms or interference with their care. People who claimed seeing someone held accountable gave them hope that their experiences would be treated seriously. The attention was taxing, but it also served as validation that what had occurred to me had significance beyond my own experience. Several medical organizations modified their rules for spotting and reporting medical negligence in the weeks following sentencing, incorporating instances such as adults denying access to glucose or insulin. Schools amended their diabetes care rules to ensure that kids had unfettered access to supplies and could not be denied treatment for hypoglycemia. The adjustments felt like something positive springing from pain, as if Olivia's brutality had unintentionally raised awareness that may help other children. 7 months after the trial, Dad and I had found a new normal. We had completed rigorous family therapy with Dr. Hayes, working through the shame, shattered trust, and terror that had almost destroyed our relationship. Dad had learned to be more diligent about my medical care without becoming pushy, and I'd learned to express my wants more plainly without fear of causing complications. We had set new habits and limitations, things like Dad checking in on my blood sugar without passing judgment, and me being honest about when I was struggling rather than attempting to conceal it to avoid being difficult. The home had been redecorated. Olivia's empty spaces were all filled with furnishings and images that mirrored our real existence together, not some ideal performance. Dad had stepped back from his company development aspirations, realizing that being present for me was more essential than securing larger contracts. Ironically, the Maxwells had contacted Dad after the trial to show their support, and they ended up offering him an even bigger deal than the initial dinner party had hoped to achieve. Mrs. Maxwell stated that they valued integrity over social performance, and Dad's instant protective response after realizing the issue impressed them more than any meticulously produced meal could ever have. I'd begun a blog on diabetes treatment from a teen's viewpoint, where I shared both practical advice and tales about dealing with medical issues as I grew older. The blog had amassed an unexpected audience, connecting me with other young people struggling with chronic diseases and providing a community of support I had not realized I needed. Writing about my experience was therapeutic, transforming pain into activism, and the response from readers demonstrated that telling the truth about terrible events may make others feel less isolated. Sophia had grown even more active in my diabetes treatment, learning about hypoglycemia symptoms and how to administer glucagon, and had developed into the type of emergency backup I required when Dad wasn't around. She'd also been my strongest supporter during the trial and rehab, providing distraction and routine when everything seemed overwhelming. The bond had grown stronger through the crisis, and I'd learned that true support required individuals who believed you and acted on that belief rather than those who expressed worry while prioritizing other things. A year after the event, I testified before the California State Legislature on medical negligence and the need for stronger safeguards for children with chronic illnesses. The testimony was part of a larger drive for legislation that would expressly criminalize interfering with a child's medical treatment closing gaps that previously allowed adults to claim ignorance or accident. I described my experience in clinical detail, including how systematic interference almost killed me. And I asked politicians to treat these situations as severely as they did physical abuse. The committee head praised me for standing up in public, and numerous politicians particularly highlighted my case when they presented the Medical Care Protection Act, which would improve reporting procedures and raise punishments for adults who intentionally prevent children from receiving critical medical treatment. The measure passed both houses and was signed into law 7 months later. Knowing that my tragedy had contributed to systemic change allowed me to comprehend what had happened. Olivia had tried to silence me and make my demands invisible, but her harshness had magnified my voice in ways she hadn't expected. I'm 19 now. I'm securely managing my type 1 diabetes, and I'm attending UCLA to study public health with an emphasis on chronic illness management in vulnerable communities. My A1C is constantly in the good range, demonstrating that I have kept the control I always had, despite Olivia's attempts to weaken it. Dad and I have reconciled. Not the same connection as before, but something deeper based on tested trust and shown commitment. He never dated seriously after Olivia. Instead, focused on rebuilding our family and supporting my ambitions. We still talk about that night from time to time, working through layers of trauma and manipulation that continue to emerge years later. The physical scars are mild, with only some small cognitive effects from the extended extreme hypoglycemia that periodically interfere with my memory. But the emotional wounds have taken continuing care to repair. Therapy is ongoing and will most likely continue indefinitely, assisting me in separating what occurred from who I am and ensuring that Olivia's actions do not define my relationship with trust or vulnerability. The locked door still emerges in dreams, although less frequently. And when it happens, I wake up knowing I'm secure, that the door is open, that supplies are nearby, and that people I care about are listening for me. Olivia remains in jail and will be eligible for release next year. I've previously written a statement to the parole board explaining why I feel she is still a threat, highlighting her utter lack of remorse and the deliberate nature of her conduct. Detective Sullivan informed me that jail records reveal she's never accepted responsibility, never admitted guilt, and claims she was the victim of a juvenile deception ploy. That continual rejection strengthens the argument for rejecting parole by demonstrating that she has not rehabilitated or learned from her misdeeds. I'm ready to testify at her parole hearing if required to stand up once more and say that putting a diabetic girl in a room as she died served 9 years, but deserved every minute of it. The state agrees with me. That agrees with me. Most essential, I agree with myself. She almost murdered me for a dinner party, for her image, and for her need to rule. Some deeds warrant repercussions rather than forgiveness. And I've come to terms with the fact that I'll be the one to make sure she faces the full penalties. Sophia occasionally wonders whether I'm angry since I'll never get those months back. Fear, deception, and a near-death experience changed the course of my life. The solution is difficult. I'm angry about what occurred, about the treachery, brutality, and system that nearly allowed someone to kill me in my own house. But I am also appreciative in unusual ways. I'm grateful that I survived, that my voice mattered, that the experience educated me about strengths I didn't realize I possessed. I learned that I could confront someone in court and state the truth, that I was capable of turning trauma into activism. Surviving a crisis sometimes meant helping others survive theirs. Would I choose to go through that again? Never. But because I went through it, I'm choosing to make it mean more than merely surviving. Olivia believed she was silencing an issue when she shut the door and went away that night. Instead, she established a voice that people could hear. In the end, that voice sealed her away. Thank you for staying till the end. I hope my tale touched some of you. It has been a long road, and it's still ongoing. I would love to hear your opinions. Have you ever had to choose yourself above your family's expectations, or leave a relationship that was holding you back? Tell me what you think in the comment section. I genuinely want to know.